I've known Michael for several years now, and he actually long ago was president of the Pohobi chapter and served as an officer like 90s, probably. I'm not gonna but now he serves as our state Idaho Native Plant Society president, so over all the chapters. And this is your second year?
Yep.
Second year doing that. And then longtime professional botanist in the area, involved in things like these guides and consulting and doing abronia surveys and conservation efforts. Yeah, and Idaho's 25 Peaks project. So some really cool field-based inventory that Michael does and uses his knowledge to further our Idaho plant conservation. And let's see what else. Oh, I don't have to mention what you told me to mention, but he's been in Idaho for a while, but he didn't come from Idaho. He came from the East Coast, so we won't mention that. But he's still got an accent that you'll notice. And I'm done.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight and a rainy night. And also Happy New Year to everybody. Tonight, I want to introduce you to some of Idaho's endemic plant species and talk about endemism a little bit. So endemics, Idaho endemics are plants that occur in Idaho and nowhere else in the world. And because of this, they're really a special part of a unique part of the biological heritage of our state. There are lots of different ways to look at endemism and reasons for endemism. Many endemics occur on odd or unusual substrates or other special edaphic situations such as serpentine soils or gypsum outcrops. Other things that influence endemism are historical processes as well as phylogenetic processes and factors. In Idaho, we're pretty lucky to have a really rich flora and some really cool plants. And this photo is just a sort of a collage of some of the endemics that I'm actually not going to be talking about tonight, but you can see that some of them are quite colorful and pretty. Some are quite small and maybe not quite as noticeable, but they're all special. The reason that I want to introduce you to Idaho endemics is like I said, I think they're a unique part of our flora and really make Idaho a special place. Let's see. We're going to figure this out. And one reason that we study and look at endemic plant species is it helps botanists and scientists and others understand plant distribution patterns, evolutionary relationships, and also can help evaluate and prioritize conservation concerns and actions. Before I introduce you to any the specific Idaho endemics, I want to just maybe first go over some patterns regarding the Idaho flora. Regarding Idaho floristics, we have about, according to the USDA plants database, we have about somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,200 plant species in Idaho, and about 130 plant families. About 2,700 of those are native, and close to almost 500 are introduced weed species. And if we use the Flora Pacific Northwest 2nd edition and Intermountain Flora as our taxonomic references, we have 69 endemic plant species in Idaho, which comes out to about 2% of the flora. And of those 69%, 29 of the 69 endemics, 29 are what I'm referring to tonight as local Idaho endemics. These are plants that are endemic to Idaho and have a distribution no greater than a 25-mile radius. The other 40, what I'm calling regional Idaho endemics, they're Idaho endemics that have a distribution greater than 25-mile-an-hour radius. But of course, as you all know, state boundaries rarely follow ecological boundaries.
Question, Michael.
Yes.
Is that 29, is that close to us, or is that no matter where they are, it's a very tiny distribution?
25-mile radius is the worldwide distribution for that species.
So it could be North Idaho, 25
Yes.
miles radius.
Yeah, not from Boise, no.
Okay.
People on Zoom probably won't be able to hear questions like that, so you might just repeat them.
Okay. Like I said, state boundaries really rarely follow ecological boundaries. So if we limit our discussion just to Idaho endemics, we miss out and we exclude 10 additional of these local endemics centered in Idaho that extend into adjacent states. Well, one example is the centennial rabbit brush, shown down here. It's known from just really a handful of populations near the Continental Divide in the southern Beaverhead Mountains, north of Du Bois. Most of the populations are on the Idaho side of the Continental Divide, but one population dribbles about 200 feet into Montana, so it's not an Idaho endemic anymore. By limiting ourselves to Idaho endemics, we exclude about 75 regional endemics that extend into adjacent states. For my purposes, these are plants that are centered in Idaho and have a worldwide distribution of 100-mile radius or less. Some of the Palouse endemics, such as Jessica aster, are examples that fit in that category. Whoops. Whoa. So there's different ways for us to assess or analyze Idaho's endemic flora. One is a taxonomic perspective. And as this slide shows, Idaho's endemic flora is represented in 23 plant families, but realize that 5 families, the aster, borage, mustard, pea, and plantain families, account for 2/3 of all Idaho endemics. And that one genus, Astragalus, with 11 endemics alone accounts for 16% of all Idaho endemics. And then we have a few other large genera, Draber and Penstemon, for example, that have multiple endemic species in Idaho. If we look at life form or habit, this slide clearly shows that the majority of Idaho endemics are perennial forbs. We have very few grasses or shrub endemics and no tree that are endemic. If we look at a gross habitat, this slide shows, I think, that Idaho endemics lean towards the dry versus the mesic end of the gradient, and that rocky habitats are a really important factor contributing to Idaho's endemic flora. Idaho's endemics are not evenly distributed across the state. This map shows Idaho divided into 6 kind of gross floristic regions, and with the associated number of endemics in each one. This map is based on a floristic map that Barbara Erda and Bob Mosley published in early 1990s, and they based that map on general floristic and vegetation patterns, supplemented by geology, climate, and soils data. North Idaho represents the extent of the continental ice sheets into Idaho. North Central Idaho, NCID, that's from the edge of the continental ice sheets during the Pleistocene down to the Salmon River. So that's largely the Clearwater Mountains and some of the other related mountain ranges. It also includes the Palouse region and most of the Columbia River basalts area as well. West central Idaho is dominated by the southern Idaho batholith. It also includes Hell's Canyon. So the Salmon River Mountains and some of the smaller mountain ranges like the Sawtooth and the Boise Mountains. East central Idaho was the mountains and valleys east of the batholith. This is an area of diverse geology, metamorphic rocks, volcanic rock, sedimentary rock, as well as the highest mountains in the state. Southwest Idaho is the Western Snake River Plain and the Owyhee country. This is an area that there's much less lava at the surface and more sedimentary exposures compared to Southeast Idaho, which encompasses the Middle Snake and the Upper Snake River Plain, as well as all those series of parallel mountain ranges south of the Snake River, you know, from the South Hills all the way to the Wyoming border. So what this, I think, shows is that East Central Idaho has the highest number of endemics in the state, whereas North Idaho has none, the Panhandle. This slide is just to show us comparing Idaho to some adjacent Western states and see where we stand with that 2%. And you can see that Idaho's 2% of endemics is pretty close to most other Western states, although nowhere really close to California, which is 33% endemics, and really just a tiny, much less than Hawaii, which has 80% of its flora is endemic, which, by the way, used to be closer to 90%, but over 100 endemic plant species in Hawaii are now extinct. And there's about 250 more plants in Hawaii that there's only about 150 plants left in the wild. So it's a situation something I want to see happen to Idaho. Each Idaho endemic has a story to tell, and we'll tell a few of them tonight. We'll kind of take a tour of the state. We don't have time to look at all 69 endemics, so what I've done is to try to just select a few from different parts of the state with a slight bias to a species within a few hours driving distance of Boise. We'll begin our tour in North Idaho, swing into and work our way south to West Central Idaho, Southwest Idaho, and then finish our tour in Central and Eastern Idaho. First plant I want to talk about is Idaho Phlox, Phlox idahonis. This is a perennial rhizomatous species that gets to at least 1 meter tall, which is more than twice the height of any other native phlox in the Pacific Northwest. It has a real pretty inflorescence of lavender flowers, although monitoring has showed that only about 1 to 5% of stems flower in a given year. It is one of the most restricted distributions of any Idaho endemic, limited to about a 3-mile radius of the small little unincorporated town of Headquarters up in the North Fork Clearwater country. Almost the entire population occurs on potlatch land, and they have helped sponsored some monitoring in past years. Its habitat is a series of mesic montane meadows surrounded by grand fir or western red cedar forest. Idaho Fox was discovered and described as a new species in the early 1940s by Edgar Weary. He was a chemist, geologist, botanist who taught at the University of Pennsylvania for many years. And phlox is one of his botanical specialties. He even tried to get phlox as the official flower of the United States back in the 1920s. But of course, he lost out to the rose. Dr. Weary, like a lot of his contemporaries at the time, because of the large size of Idaho Phlox, assumed it was most closely related to some of the large showy phloxes from the eastern United States, such as Phlox maculata and Phlox carolina. However, about 20 years ago, some molecular genetic work was done on this species, on Phlox idahoanus, and they found out it was actually most closely related to longleaf phlox, Phlox longifolia, shown in this photo, which is a common western species most of you have seen if you've done any hiking in southern Idaho. You know, and that rarely gets even close to a foot tall. So I guess maybe the moral of the story is looks aren't everything. Just moving a little bit south from the Clearwater country takes us to our next Idaho endemic, Swingus biscuit root. Lomation is a genus that's endemic to the western United States, and with at least 75 species, it's by far the largest genus in the parsley family in North America. The common name for a lot of them is biscuit root. That's because some species were staple food for some Native American tribes in the western US. Swingus biscuit root is one of the more recent additions to the Idaho endemics list, being described as a new species in 2014. And there's the citation for it. It's a you can see from some of the photos here, it has a kind of tuberous root, thick root, has yellow flowers that bloom as early as March, which is pretty early up from where it occurs. It flowers into June, but probably the most distinguishing factor of this species are the leaflets, which are all kind of point to one direction on the rachis. They also have a sharp point at the tip. And as anybody who has tried to key an unknown lomation can attest to, you usually need mature fruits to identify them. And those for this species are much longer than wide. Swingus biscuit root is known from one population in the world with several thousand plants. And that's it. That probably makes it the most restricted distribution of any Idaho endemic in our flora. Yeah. Well, let me go back here a second. That one population is located on the Joseph Plains, which is that plateau of land that separates the Salmon and the Snake River, about 20 miles west of Grangeville, with the Snake River plunging off on the west side and the Snake River Canyon on the east side. Its habitat is reported to be a dry, rocky meadow within a ponderosa pine woodland matrix. You can see, that's the site where this plant occurs. So, like I said, probably the most restricted distribution of any Idaho endemic. Continuing a little further south, comes to our next Idaho endemic, Salmon River stonecrop, Sedum valens. The numerous succulent leaves and the bright yellow flowers make this a striking plant, in my opinion. It's distinguished by having a rosette of large succulent leaves about 4 inches in diameter. And it's also one of only 2 stone crops in the United States that have ciliate leaf margins. It has a very limited distribution also. It occurs in the Salmon River Canyon upstream from Riggins. In this area, it occurs on rock outcrops and rock ledges, as well as in the duff underneath ponderosa pine and Douglas fir on north and east facing slopes in the lower parts of the canyon. This is another relatively recently addition to the Idaho endemic list. It was discovered in the early 2000s by Curtis Bjork, who at the time was affiliated with the University of Idaho Stillinger Herbarium. And I'll mention Curtis's name a few more times tonight. I think this is the Salmon River stonecrop is really an example of a plant that shows you don't have to go into remote wilderness to find new plant species. This is right along, a well-traveled road corridor in the Salmon River Canyon. The genus Carex, sedges, is a very large group of plants. It's probably at least 2,000 plant sedge species in the world. We have about 100 of them here in Idaho, which makes it the most species-rich genus in our flora. And if you've hiked around Idaho at all, you have come across sedge species. But one I doubt many of you have ever seen is this one, Indian Valley sedge, Carex aboriginum. It's distinguished by having this bunch grass, bunchy habit, having this separate. I lost my cursor. And then lost it. Well, anyway, it has separate male and female spikes, and then the fruits are these large perigynia with relatively large teeth on them. Indian Valley sedge was discovered in 1899 by Marcus Jones, an intrepid early botanical explorer. He discovered it in Indian Valley, which is east of Cambridge, Idaho. And this plant was not collected again for decades and thought to maybe be extinct, especially after some surveys in the early 1990s failed to find any populations. But in 1999, almost a century to the exact date from Marcus Jones's original collection, Curtis Bjork relocated the population outside of Mesa in Adams County. Subsequent surveys by Fish and Game, BLM, and Forest Service botanists found about 10 other new populations in the council area, extending south into northern Washington County. It's really one of the rarest plants in our flora, as most of these populations have no more than 100 plants. Its habitat is these areas that are ephemerally wet, such as along intermittent creeks, meadows that dry out near seeps. Basically, the transition zone between areas that are saturated and dry uplands. Well, I mentioned that Carex is a large genus. Well, Astragalus is even larger. And in fact, with over 3,000 species, it's the largest genus of flowering plants on Earth. And it just so happens that Western US is one of the centers of diversity for this group. We have over 400 taxa. About 75 of those occur in Idaho. One of them is Packard's milkfish. It's a multi-stem perennial. Oh, sorry. It's a multi-stem perennial with these light lavender flowers. And these pendulous, lustrous, often golden, but sometimes red mottled fruit pods. It'd be quite striking. This is another one of the rarest plants in our flora. Its distribution is limited to about a 10 square mile area in the northeast corner of Payette County. In this area, it's restricted to these dry, relatively sparsely vegetated edaphic outcrops, sedimentary outcrops. And as these photos show, most of the surrounding sagebrush steppe in this area is long gone due to wildfires and been replaced by annual grassland vegetation. Most populations occur on BLM land, but a few are also on adjoining private or state properties. It's a long time BLM special status plant species, and for several years was also a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act. In 2008, a monitoring program was initiated for this plant to try to get a better handle on its conservation status, and it showed that almost all populations are impacted by human-related disturbances, such as off-road motorcycle, hill climbing, wildfire, weed invasion, livestock, sheep and cattle trampling. Recognizing the need to do something about its conservation, improve its conservation outlook, the BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service collaborated on a series of proactive conservation measures, including closing most of this area that Packett's milkfish occurs to off-road motorized use, and also constructing a number of exclosures to keep cattle out of and sheep out of occupied habitat. Some of the other conservation measures over the years include ongoing monitoring, some pollinator genetic studies, seed collecting, and also outgrowing plants, plants to put back into the field, and even some habitat restoration areas near outcrops that have the Packett's milkfish. All of these proactive conservation measures have helped, and more recent monitoring has showed that the population is stabilized and human-related impacts have been reduced very substantially. And as a result, it was taken off the candidate list for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Although it still faces challenges, I consider Packett's milkfish a conservation success story for Idaho. Does anybody remember where they were on May 18th, 1980? May 10th, May 18th, 1980. That's the day Mount St. Helens blew. It also happens to be the day that Dr. Pat Packard led a Native Plant Society hike to the hills east of Payette, and they collected unknown milkfish. Unable to identify it, Dr. Packard sent it to Rupert Barnaby at the New York Botanical Garden, who was the world's expert on the milkfish group. It took a few years, but Dr. Barnaby eventually described that plant as a new species, Packett's naming it in honor of Dr. Packard, Packett's milkfish, Stragulus picardii. Dr. Packard taught botany at the College of Idaho for many, many years, mentored many botanists, and really added a lot to our knowledge of the Idaho flora. A plant that some of you are probably familiar with hiking around the Boise foothills in the springtime is Aussies Onion, Allium Aussii. It's a ground-hugging plant with small, but I think striking pink flowers that bloom early in the springtime. It's endemic to southwestern Idaho. The bulk of its population occurs in an arc from Boise towards Emmett, and there's a couple of disjunct populations over the sandhills by Weiser. There's probably about 70 occurrences of Aussies onion that we know about. Most are at least partly on private land, but some are also on BLM, City of Boise, and Ada County landfill property. Its habitat is these dry, well-drained, sandy soil sites in the lower foothills. Typically in areas that support it, or at least used to support bitterbrush or bitterbrush sagebrush plant communities. But as you know, a lot of this the native sagebrush steppe, shrub steppe habitat in this region has been severely degraded over time due to wildfire, weed invasion. Let me get this guy to show again. Maybe that top picture is an allium next to some seedlings of brush skeleton weed. Recreational impacts are another thing. There's a photo of an Aussie population in Polecat Gulch that's bisected by a popular hiking trail, wildfire, and even other disturbances such as pocket gopher digging, which in of by itself might not be a big deal, but disturbances like that seem to exacerbate the weed establishment. So it's a plant that faces many challenges, not only the ones I mentioned here, but actually also outright habitat loss due to housing developments in the foothills. A lot of that in recent decades. And also there's been quite an expansion in the last decade or so at the sanitary landfill at Seaman Gulch has resulted in a lot of loss of habitat. Here's, these pink flags are Aussies Onion plants, getting buried by a new area that they're going to bury our garbage. And this photo here is also an area where they've already kind of consolidated, covered with soil, but a few Aussies Onion plants are coming back, actually. It's kind of interesting. So with all the issues with it, loss of habitat and degradation of habitat, there's been an increase in conservation concern for the species in recent years. And one response to that concern was INPS Bohobie chapter and the city of Boise Parks and Rec forming a partnership to monitor Aussies Onion on 5 city of Boise properties: Camel's Back Reserve, Military Reserve, Hulls Gulch Reserve, Polecat Reserve, and Hillside to Hollow Reserve. So in 2021, we established 23 monitoring plots and selected subpopulations in the reserves with the schedule to resample every 3 years. Some photos here of that. The baseline data in 2021 showed really a wide range in abundance from one subpopulation to the next, from fewer than 10 plants in some plots to over 3,000 plants in some plots. Suggesting that some subpopulations are doing fine, and others are vulnerable to local extirpation. But we'll be going back and probably monitoring some of these plants again, studying it in 3 years, which will be next year. Aussies Onion was actually first collected in 1881 by Major Timothy Wilcox, U.S. Army, when he was stationed at Fort Boise. But it was not until 1950 that Marion Ownby, the botany professor at Washington State University and a specialist in the genus Allium, described Aussies Onion as a new species. He named it in honor of his colleague, Hannah Aussie, who we often collaborated with on some of his projects. Dr. Aussie herself had a wide range of interests, and one of them was trying to find the origin of wheat, which, as many of you know, is an annual grass species. Well, a few years ago, researchers at Washington State University produced a hybrid perennial wheat by crossing wheat triticum with a western wheatgrass Dinopyrum. And they named this new novel grain Tritopyrum aussii in honor of Dr. Hannah Aussie for all her pioneering work done on wheat back in the 1930s and 40s. And this photo over here is just shows some of the chromosomes for this hybrid with the triticum one color and the dinopyrum another color. Well, he's staying close to home again. Another plant, maybe a few of you have seen hiking in the foothills, although it's not as common as Aussies Onion, is Boise Sandra being a Abronia mellifera variety Poviorum. It's a perennial with kind of really a showy perennial, I should say, with these white to light pinkish, mildly fragrant, trumpet-shaped flowers. It's distinguished from some other Abronias by these large, distinct, broad bracts that subtend the inflorescence. It's another Southwest Idaho endemic on the north side of the Snake River Plain, mainly from Boise to the Emmett Horseshoe Bend areas. It's not known, it's only known really from relatively few populations and none of them very large. Its habitat is sand or lake bed sediments in the lower foothills up to about 3,600 feet in areas that do, or at least used to support shrub steppe habitat. This species was overlooked for many years and thought to be just identified oftentimes as Abronia fragrans, which is a more widespread common species. But about 10 years ago, Barbara Erda, a person many of you know, a Boise born and raised plant taxonomist, started looking more critically at this species. And being an astute observer, Barbara realized it's different. In 2000, based on morphological, geographical, and genetic analysis, Barbara and her colleague published a paper, describing this as a new species back in 2016. There's a photo of Barbara there. You notice that in the title of the paper, it mentions that this species is of conservation concern. So soon after it was published, it was added to the INPS rare plant list. And we don't have a lot of information about this species, as it turns out. It's known from probably less than 20 locations. And the ones we do know about, none of them have very many plants. So the conservation outlook for the species is a little bit nebulous and don't know a lot about it. And recognizing this, again, last year, 2022, INPS Bohove chapter again partnered with the city of Boise to conduct surveys for the species on 8 Boise city properties. And some of you in this room helped on that. And I thank you. Unfortunately, we didn't find any new populations. Well, if any of you have been to Craters of the Moon, you've seen this plant, whether you know it or not. Craters of the Moon buckwheat. It's part of, it's part of the really wonderful wildfire flower display you see in late spring in craters that contrast so vividly with the black cinders. Craters of the Moon buckwheat has these white to light yellowish flowers and a basal rosette of leaves from anywhere from a couple inches to nearly a foot in diameter. For many years, it was thought to just be an odd expression of Eriogonum ovalifolium variety depressum, which is typically a plant found at high elevations. But research done by James Reveal, who wrote the treatment on buckwheats for Flora of North America, and Don Mansfield, who's sitting right here, who recently retired professor of botany from College of Idaho. They looked at this entity more closely and realized it warranted taxonomic recognition. the name variety Philparium is Latin for oven, recognition of its cindery habitat. It varies. It varies from variety depressum. You can see it has much whiter, denser hairs on the leaves compared to variety depressum, which has hairs on the leaves, but you can still see the green there. As far as I know, it's still only known from Craters of the Moon National Monument. Where it could be locally common is shown here in this picture. It grows in slopes and these flats of volcanic cinder, which are, can cover which covers large areas in the northern part of the monument. I hope most of you have been to Craters of the Moon at least once in your life. If you haven't, I recommend it, especially in the late springtime when the flora is full bore. It could be quite a wonderful place. It's a relatively recently evolved landscape, probably within the last 15,000 years. So Craters of the Moon buckwheat is probably a relatively recently evolved entity as well. Craters of the Moon area is the result of about a minimum of 8 periods of eruptions in the last 15,000 years. The last one about 2,000 years ago. Here are a few photos from different parts of the monument. So again, it's worth the pilgrimage if you've never been there before. We have a lot of species of fleabanes in Idaho, probably close to 40, but none of them more rare or with a more limited distribution than salmon river fleabane, Iridgeron Salmonensis. It's a lax plant with the dark green, thin leaves, white rays that turn pink as it age, and very precise habitat requirements. Its known distribution is the lower 25 miles of the Middle Fork Salmon River Canyon and some of the lower parts of its tributaries, and also the type collection on the Salmon River near the confluence with the Middle Fork. It occurs on steep to vertical large rock walls, in cracks and crevices and small ledges. These are sites that receive little, if any, sunlight, even in the middle of summer. This species was discovered by Pam and Steve Brunsfeld back in the early 1980s. As Pam tells the story, she and Steve went to on the Salmon River Road near where the confluence of the Middle Fork is to look at some plants, especially a gooseberry that Steve was interested in. When they got there, Steve jumped out of the car and went to go look for the gooseberry, while Pam stayed behind with the screaming 1-month-old baby Courtney. Eventually, Courtney calmed down, and Pam went scrambling in nearby rock outcrop and came across a Iridgeron she didn't recognize. She couldn't key it out. Steve got back to the car a little while later. He couldn't key it out. He couldn't figure it out. They sent it to Guy Neeson, a specialist in the Aster family, and eventually Steve and Guy described it as a new species in 1989. In 1992, it was still only known from that original type location. That was the year that Bob Mosley and myself were lucky enough to float the Middle Fork Salmon River to do a survey for this species. And we discovered 13 new populations, all in the Frank Church River Northern Wilderness. And as far as I know, no new populations have been discovered since. Penstemon is another genus that's well represented in Idaho, including 4 endemics. The only one I'm going to talk about is Salmon River Penstemon, Salmon River Mountains Penstemon, Penstemon Simonensis. It's a relatively recently described species, described in 2017 by Noel Holmgren. It's a subshrub that's going to sprawl sprawly stems, kind of egg-shaped leaves, horseshoe-shaped anthers, excuse me, the toothed leaves, and kind of blue flowers that bloom in late June, early July. It's limited to the Salmon River Mountains in central Idaho, from the southeast Valley County into parts of Lemhi, Custer, and Valley County. It's a rock habitat plant. It grows in talus and rock cracks, ledges, on rocky slopes. It was first collected in the 1930s by Ray Davis, a professor for many years at Idaho State University. And there were a few subsequent collections over the years, subsequent decades. They were all identified as Penstemon diphilus, or occasionally Penstemon richardsonii. But when Noel Holmgren was preparing his treatment for the Penstemons for Pacific Northwest Flora, second edition, a few years ago, he was looking at these specimens and realized that some of them were different. And those differences warranted taxonomic recognition, and he named it Salmon River Penstemon. It's distinguished from Penstemon diphilus by having egg-shaped leaves that are kind of rounded at the tip, versus the leaves of Penstemon diphilus, which are more linear or lanceolate and have pointed at the tip. And also, if you notice, the upper leaves for Salmon River Mountain Penstemon have a small petiole typically, while those for Penstemon diphilus are always attached directly to the stem. Oh, it's getting ready to down the home stretch here. The largest concentration of endemic plant species in Idaho is the Salmon River corridor, from Clayton downstream to Salmon. This area has 11 endemics, the greatest concentration in the state. One thing they all share in common is a restriction to chalice volcanic group rocks. This is a really diverse mix of rocks linked to a series of large volcanic and other tectonic events that took place in central Idaho 40 to 50 million years ago. The Chalice region is also one of the driest parts of the state. The canyon bottoms averaging no more than 8 inches of precip a year. So this combination of aridity, odd substrates, diverse odd substrates, and a lot of erosive, unstable habitats seem to have all played a role in the concentration of endemics in this area. And here's some photos of some of the geology in that area. You can see it can be quite colorful. Among the endemics in this area are 3 species of Astragalus: Chalice milkfish, Lemhi milkfish, and Beckwith's milkfish. They're all low-growing plants that are restricted to usually to unstable rock, talus, or gullies and washes within desert shrub vegetation. They're differentiated from each other by features of the hairs, flower size and color, but most importantly, the pods are different, which is typical for Astragalus. Here's a distribution map for those 3. The Chalice milkfish, you can see, is most common in the Salmon River corridor, upstream from Chalice, but a few populations extend east into the Pacimoroi, lower slopes of the Pacimoroi range. Lemhi milkfish, from Clayton up to Ellis, then has a bunch of populations that go up the East Fork, Salmon River, and then a few over in the Lemhi Valley. Whereas Beckwith's milkfish is pretty much more or less restricted to Salmon River Canyon in Custer and Lemhi counties. Another Chalice endemic is elusive Jacob's ladder, Polonium elusum. some of you know Jessica Irwin. Before she moved to Idaho, she was a graduate student at the University of Wyoming under Ron Hartman, doing a floristic inventory of the Salmon River the Salmon Chalice National Forest. This was back in 2010. It was during that time that Jessica discovered elusive Jacob's ladder. And this is not, some small cryptic little species. It's about 1.5 feet tall and has a really colorful inflorescence of blue flowers. It's distinguished by these clear membranes that connect the calyx lobes, which is unique for your perennial Poloniums. Also, unlike most perennial Poloniums, this does not have a skunky odor. Jessica discovered, I think, about 7 or so populations, all within a 7-mile radius of the little, quote, town of Ellis, which is really no more than a wide spot in the road where the Cimarroy River meets the Salmon River, between Chalice and Salmon. Despite its very restricted distribution, it seems to be a habitat generalist. It's known from the valley bottom, canyon bottoms, up to fairly high in the mountains. It's known from sagebrush steppe, mountain mahogany, and even underneath Douglas fir. So it's kind of unusual in that regard. I've actually never seen this species, and one of these days I hope to, though. Well, I saved the most recent, I should say, Idaho endemic, recently described Idaho endemic for last. And that's Lemhi Valley Townsendia. Up until 2022, there were 6 Townsendias in Idaho Flora. Now there's 7. This guy here. And this is another recent discovery by Curtis Bjork, who back in 2012 was hiking around in the Lemhi Valley, came across this plant and thought maybe it represented a new species. So he took some photos and sent material to Chris Lee and Jeanette Witten, who are specialists in this genus. And they agree that Curtis is probably onto something. But it took them 5 years for the stars to align for them to get to Idaho and look at this plant by themselves in the field. And there are several other Townsendias in the Lemhi Valley. And at first, because of that, they thought maybe it was just a funny hybrid. But in the end, they realized it was different enough to warrant taxonomic recognition, and they described it as a new species. It differs from, well, first of all, let's say that it's a small, low-growing plant, 1 inch or 2 tall the most, has this rosette of really silvery, hairy leaves, white to light pinkish rays, and is distinguished from the several other Townsendias in that part of the world by lacking an elongating stem, the size of the involucre bracts, a persistent pappus, which is these bracts here. It also flowers earlier than any of the other species. It's known from only 3 populations within a few miles of each other in the upper Lemhi Valley, all on BLM land. Its habitat is this white, ashy, pulverized, rhyolitic tuff, relatively sparsely vegetated, And in essence, these outcrops where it occurs are islands surrounded by a sea of more heavily vegetated sagebrush steppe. And that's not an uncommon feature for Idaho endemics. The genus is named after David Townsend, a botanist from early American botanist from Pennsylvania. And I'll let you read the dedication for Townsendia by William Hooker, who was an eminent British botanist back in the day. That's when people had some really flowery way to write. I think I'll end by just saying that the discovery of this Townsendia is another example of that. You don't have to be in virgin remote wilderness to find new plant species. This is again just a mile or so from the road, these sites. So part of the, I think, model of the story is get out there and enjoy Idaho's rich flora. And if you notice something different, maybe it is. There's a lot of cool nooks and crannies to explore in Idaho, and I encourage you to get out there and learn the plants, and who knows what you'll find. Some of the photos in this presentation are mine. Most of the good ones are taken by other people, and I want to thank them all. And with that, if there's any time, I'll take questions. Yes, sir.
Michael, there are two general categories of endemics, neo-endemics or paleo-endemics. Seems like most of ours are all neo-endemics. Do we have any paleo-endemics that are sort of residuals from, as opposed to more recently evolved
Right.
species like most of them?
I mean, probably not. I mean, we have one endemic genus, Daisy notus, in the Borash family up in the Clearwater. And whether that's a recently evolved genus or maybe a remnant, a relic of something it's the last of its kind, I don't know. That's one that maybe fit that the paleo category, but nobody's done any analysis of that or anything like that. But most, if not all, probably neo-endemics, relatively recently evolved. And by recent, I don't mean the last few decades. It could be a million years.
Yeah.
But not like paleoendemics. A classic is like redwood tree, which is once upon a time had a much wider distribution, and now is contracted to its a small section of Northern California, Southern Oregon, but in the fossil record for 180 million years. So it's an example of paleoendemic.
Okay, we have about 45 people joining us online this evening. We have one question asking what is the closest endemic for Northern Idaho?
Where in Northern Idaho? The most northern one is probably Pseudostellaria up by St. Mary's. And then there's several in the Clearwater country.
Would you guess if there's any areas in Idaho that might be black holes botanically where people might find more endemics?
Sure. A lot of pretty big chunks of Idaho roadless, parts of the Frank Church Wilderness, in the Selway Bitterroot country, as far as I know, a lot of that country's had very few, even some places no collections over the years. That's one big chunk of ground. I don't know, Don, is the Oahes, are there still some corners of the Oahes that nobody's really gotten to?
Yes, but it's the places that haven't been visited, I think, are pretty homogeneous, and probably don't have much. But what about the southern Southern Lost River range. Has that been pretty thoroughly botanized by you and Bob and others?
No, it's been botanized, but thoroughly, it's again, a lot of it's
Not
remote
necessarily.
country. A lot of it's difficult to get to. So there are some black holes, yes. And whether they harbor new species or, new populations of rare ones, awaits you checking it out.
In terms of the Hawaii region, the southern, between Sheep Creek and the main Bruno, there's a lot of country in there. I've seen very few collections in that area.
Yeah.
That's kind of.
I have Mark online wanted to note that the newly described Townsendia species is a polyploidy asexual plant, doesn't require pollinators. The individuals are all essentially clones.
Who's that?
Mark Derach.
Oh, Direct. Okay. There you go.
Michael,
Is it big?
I think that links to my next, my question was, what kind of, you mentioned the endemics or the edaphic ones that you showed us lots of. Then you mentioned the historical processes, which I guess the paleoendemics, which we don't have. And then the third one would be the phylogenetics, which apparently this Townsendia Salmonensis and this paintbrush could be, are there others?
What do you mean by phylogenetic?
Well, you said it, but
Oh, I said phylogenetic influences, lineages could be a factor, like typically like large genera like Astragalus, Drabus, Penstemon, they'll have more endemics. They're groups that are still speciating as we speak. They're not at some sort of phylogenetic dead end. They're still radiating. That's what I meant by that.
okay, so I suppose the Cascalea then would be, because that was something that evolved right there on Mount Harrison.
And and that's kind of an unusual case in some ways because it's a hybrid speciation, which I think up until then was not known for Cascalea. When Danielle Clay, a graduate student at Boise State University, did her thesis on that plant, that was what they discovered.
Yeah. The Gallipolis, I remember.
Yeah.
But are there others like that?
I don't know if enough work's been done in any of the plants to really say one way or the other. That's not that I'm familiar with. Like the Packard's milk vetch. There's in northern Idaho, Hell's Canyon country, there's Astragalus cusickii, variety cusickii. You get down to the Salmon River Canyon, you have Astragalus cusickii variety. No, I can't remember. There's another variety. And then when you get down to Payette County, you have what was originally described as Astragalus cusickii variety Picardii, but now it's Astragalus Picardii. There's gaps in between each one. So you can visualize how maybe they have a common ancestor, but have been separated geographically over time and now genetically isolated enough to be different species.
Sterilus is that.
And there's Astragalus sterilus, exactly. Another related species, yeah. Carrie?
So I grew up in Salmon, not knowing I was in the hotbed. And at the time, I didn't know much botany. And so unfortunately, I didn't make any new discoveries, but I'm
Not too late.
I can still go back and visit my parents and find stuff, but I'm wondering what individuals can do. Say they're out and about and they think there's something unique. I mean, we don't have as many professional botanists in certain agencies as we have in the past, and so maybe we rely on the public and what they can find, or individuals what they can find. If someone is in a black hole and finds something that they think is really unique, what can they do, or how would they know?
The only way they're going to know it's maybe unique is if they have some knowledge of the general flora anyway. Otherwise, everything's going to look unique if you don't know any of the plants. So you have to, I mean, to really define some of these plants like Curtis has, it takes first a keen interest in nature, I think, and then a discriminating eye to notice that something might be different. But to get to that point, it takes experience with the flora to kind of say, oh, that maybe that is different. It's not something, you can just pick out typically, with that experience.
So people could take the Spread Plants Guide out and find, and maybe start learning more about what ones are unique out there. And if they
Oh,
find
yes.
new populations, then you tell Fish and Game, you go to Fish and Game's website or then Conservation Data Center.
Lynn, you want to answer that?
It's very university. It's like with your, if somebody sent me a Townsendia, I wouldn't know if it was unique, but Don probably did.
Yeah. I always say make a collection.
Right. If the population is large enough, you can make a collection.
Send it to me.
And it could get it verified. And if it is a new population, then that information will eventually get to the Natural Heritage Program and be put into the rare plant database for the state.
And anyone collecting, even if it isn't super rare, it's still so worthwhile to have those collections for just geographic information or local variation. Collecting is probably one of the most valuable things someone could do.
Barbara Eder wanted to point out that you get new tax, even in the Boise area, not just the remote corners of the state.
Yeah, I think I try to make that.
Yeah.
Try to make that.
Exactly. Wendy Green also was interested, are there any monitoring or conservation work being done with regards to the Indian Valley sedge?
No, not that I'm aware of, but Lynn might have this information.
A little. It occurs on Cecil Land versus WMA, which is Fish and Game Wildlife Management Area. And so my colleague Jennifer Miller led a study there last summer, but it was pretty limited. She was right on the WMA and then a couple nearby occurrences. There's in the past, I know BLM has worked on it some too, like they built an exclosure on Dodson Pass around one of the EOs. So there's some attention paid to it, but it could certainly stand some more. Someone lives in that area and wants to work on it.
There was some monitoring, by Chris Murphy years ago, but I think that petered out pretty quickly. Anybody else there, Kirsten?
I think there was the other last question, we had somebody ask what your favorite plant in Idaho was. That's the laugh.
Favorite keys. Don?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm gonna ask a question for Del Weens, who wanted to be here.
Yeah, where is Del?
He is not feeling well.
Okay,
So
bummer.
He bagged out.
Okay.
He planned to come and he wanted to send apologies to all of you who know him, that he wasn't able to come tonight, but he would ask the question about there's not a synonymy between endemism and rarity. He's very interested in rarity as a mechanism of extinction, in which plant species become extinct by mechanisms intrinsic to the biology of the species, as opposed to stochastic events of a windfall, something like that, where the populations decrease as a result of limited reproductive capability. And so he wanted to ask the question, do you know of any, or do you know, or as you encounter any of these rarer endemics, he wants to know the seed ovule ratios of them. How many
That sounds like a Del question.
But I told him I would ask it for him. And so there you go.
We don't have any Deckers in Idaho that I know of.
But he's been extending that work
Yeah.
a lot. And so any of the.
Those are mostly paleo endemics.
Not all, but
not
mostly,
all.
yes, mostly they are.
Probably mostly.
And so that's, my guess is probably not, but he's been looking at things other than paleo endemics to find rarity tied to limited reproductive capability that he thinks is tied to in long-lived perennials like the decorative genetic load accumulating through time.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies in Idaho that could really.
No, I don't know of any study, but maybe you know, as you're handling these things, do you know any that have lots more?
Well, we did a study years back in the early nineties on Ariaga melodonum, a buckwheat that's in the Stanley Basin area, and was a seed collecting, and then we did seed viability testing, and most seeds were aborted. There's very few that produced seeds, and whether that was only a year or two study, so whether that was a typical situation or not, you know, it might be hard to make those assumptions. But probably some of them are maybe do have limitations, and we just don't know. A few have had pollinator studies have shown different things that they need to be outcrossed or not. So, you know, if there's limitations of pollinators, that could be an impact. That's one of the things for the packaged milk veg, actually, is they're afraid of, you have those outcrops that are separated by this sea of weeds.
Right.
Can the pollinators, you know, go and do their business between, you know, the subpopulations or not? So maybe over time, that could accumulate problems. Since this habitat degradation is relatively recent, you know, in the last decades, you know, not thousands of years. So I don't know. Mhm. All right.
I've got one final last comment, maybe. Mark Derach says he wants to mention that he is currently listening to this presentation. He's multitasking and measuring formation seeds on a new species from Central Washington State at the same time. Lots of undescribed things out there.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and